Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. Now, before we get to today's episode, I did want to mention that recently I had the opportunity to write about my experience for Autism Spectrum News as an entrepreneur and learning to honor my limitations. So if you want to learn about my experience as an autistic entrepreneur, you can check that out in the current issue of Autism Spectrum News. Check out the podcast description for a link for the article. So we often talk about community here on Autism Stories, and one opportunity for community can be in religious services. So on today's episode, Rabbi Tzemah Yoreh joins us to discuss being a congregational rabbi, his new book, So Compassionate It Hurts, and what he learned about his autistic identity studying ancient wisdom literature. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Rabbi Tzemah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to start out by just learning about your story and where it begins in the autistic community.
Absolutely. Well, my story, like I feel a fair number of people in my generation, I'm in my mid 40s, begins with a deep recognition that you're on a different, you're relating to the world differently than the vast majority of the people around you, that you're kind of out of sync. When I had that recognition in myself from early childhood, something was always off, I would say. And I didn't have any language about what was off. My parents, I would say, are good parents. They try to acknowledge the symptoms, like not being able to look people in the eye, not distinguishing between right and left. But they couldn't, they couldn't acknowledge or help with the actual situation I was in because there was simply not a language around it in the 80s. And so that persisted into adulthood, I would say. And I kept on searching for answers. And eventually I read an autobiography of somebody on the spectrum. And I said, wow, that kind of check. And that's when I okay, that's the beginning of my journey. And I would say I kind of kept it to myself. I kind of figured, who cares? I am an academic. There are lots of academics that fit my profile. Generally, it's my own idiosyncratic situation or whatever. That's how I felt about it. I didn't really, if somebody brought it up, I would acknowledge it, but it was not really, I didn't see it core to the way I looked at the world. And that shifted, I would say, fairly profoundly in the past 5 years. And it began with me becoming a rabbi of the community, but also having a son who is on a deeper band of the spectrum than I am. And I think got a diagnosis of autism when he was 4. And, and those two things have shaped my identity as part of the autistic community greatly, and really shifted the way I think about it. My desire to advocate, not, I'm not alone out there, connect to other people on the spectrum, offer inspiration, offer a place for people who are neurotypical, atypical, beyond people on the spectrum. I have a platform to do so, to advocate, and I'm trying to now use that platform for the benefit of people with difference in general.
Now, one of the first things that popped into my mind when learning about you and that you're a rabbi in some ways has nothing to do with you, and it's your congregation. So when they learned that you are autistic, I guess I'm assuming they know. What have been some of the feedback you've received, maybe positive or maybe not so positive from them?
There were psychologists, a number of them on the search committee that hired me, as a rabbi. So they were quite cognizant of where I landed. One of the psychologists on the search committee has a son who is on the spectrum as well. Like there was no lack of knowledge of who they were hiring. And I really found that to be admirable. Meaning, the idea that somebody, that a group of people will see beyond autism and see the attributes that I bring, the gifts that I bring to a type of job, that really impressed me greatly about this community from the outset. And I was like, my interview process was one of bemusement. I had no expectation actually of getting the job. Because I just really do not fit the profile of a congregational rabbi. So there was an acknowledgement right away, and there was offers. I got coaching on how to do small talk, which is something that you have to do as a pastor leader. Schmoozing, they call it in Yiddish. And also I got coaching in public speaking. How to modulate, how to speak, modulate tone, modulate volume, acknowledgement that was not my strong suit. And that was there from the beginning. So that was very, very, I would say overall, very, very positive. I would say the one somewhat not positive, I wouldn't go so far as to call it negative, is that I was asked, especially in the past year and a half when I became more involved in this book project and such, to not overly emphasize being on the spectrum in my sermons or as I spoke to the congregation, because the thought was that if I overemphasized that, I would be pushing people away. That, because you are on the spectrum, you can't talk to people who are not on the spectrum or talk to neurotypical people and such. That kind of, they acknowledged that wasn't the case, but they thought that some people might think that and wanted me to tone those parts of my sermons down. And I would say that I pushed back at that to some degree, but I have toned it down a touch in response. So yeah, that I would say, but overall, going back to what I said initially, very, very positive. I would say the congregation has been very positive, and they've asked me how, people, when I started talking about the book, people have talked to me, so how can we support people on the spectrum? How can we support neurodiversity? How can we support you? And that's, I would say, the vast majority of people.
Now you mentioned not feeling like you fit the profile of a congregational rabbi. In what ways do you feel like you don't fit? Well, what would you say the profile is, and then how do you feel like you don't fit that?
I would say somebody who's naturally extroverted is more likely to be a congregational rabbi. Somebody who has natural connections, can establish natural connections to people, can function well with eye contact, can play a room. Those are attributes that are associated with being a rabbi. I am not extroverted at all. I'm quite highly introverted, and I don't have those. I don't have a great memory for faces. It's and those are, that's the profile. Gregariousness. I'm not a particularly gregarious person. I don't really fit the profile from that perspective. But I would say, again, it balances out. There are things that I bring to the rabbinate that somebody who fits that profile might not bring. And that's why I say, I've always thought, the book, the idea is ironic that you would become a congregational rabbi, but if you read the book, you discover that it's not ironic, and this is actually something that I could do and do well, and it just takes a little bit of a shift in thinking about it.
Now, oftentimes when people think about employment and accommodations, they think about the employees themselves, but maybe not so much someone that might be in a position like you and be the leader of the organization.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what accommodations have you needed from your temple, from your congregation, to be the best rabbi you can be?
So as I said, they were from the outset very cognizant of where I was coming from. They offered me coaching that I paid for by the congregation, and were generous about it. They had it renewed, and then they offered me guidance, from an acknowledged public orator, as much as I wanted on that score. So they got right away, and I would say that that's not something you generally offer regular employees at your organization, which is might be a little bit unfortunate. Meaning, that type of thinking. I have the privilege of being the leader of the organization, so they are taking an extra step towards me, whereas employees are not necessarily given those extra steps. And that's, I regard that as not fair or equitable, but that is the case. Otherwise, let's see, what other accommodations? Beyond that, I police my time. Like, I am very, very careful I'm a half-time employee, and I'm very careful about remaining a half-time employee, because I know that for me, like, I cannot, if it starts sliding to the full-time, I am unable to to function. It will become too hard for me. There will be too much of the social headaches and being drained, and I could not function well. I guard that, and sometimes that's caused tension, meaning there are times such as at the beginning of the pandemic, when I was working, like lots of rabbis, really overtime, meaning I was like working double. And I said, I asked for extra pay for that time, and it was respected. But afterwards, that was, it became more of an issue, and I've had to police my time better. I've had to slow walk certain things or make sure that I have the right support. That is, I would say, it's more difficult for an organization to do that. And this is a perennial problem with part-time employees, especially rabbis. It's almost never is exactly part-time. But I am better able to police that. I'm better able to say to the lay leadership of my institution, hey, I'm overtime. I can't be overtime. You have to do this or this, otherwise it becomes too difficult for me. Other members of the organization would find it much more difficult.
Now, I read where you said it's critical to teach tolerance and embrace different family structures, different gender and sexual orientations, different races, and different neural makeups. So what are some things you think rabbis can or should do to make sure that their congregations are embracing all of these differences within their community?
So I would say that one of the most important things a rabbi can do is to have people be heard, make sure that the members of the community are heard. How I do it is make sure that there are programs that highlight neurodiversity, or programs that highlight LGBTQ identity, or just one-on-one conversations with people who are on the spectrum, and or other neurodiversities, and just me being very open about it. I think being open about where you come from, your difference, gives an opening for others to say, hey, the rabbi is modeling this. The rabbi is showing that people of difference are members of this community and are valued. I also should be valued. Modeling is the best thing a leader can do, I believe. Look at yourself as a microcosm of your community. See yourself as live your own life the way you want your community to look like. I try to do that. Do I succeed? Sometimes, and sometimes not. It's always a not straightforward path, but one tries.
Now, prior to becoming a rabbi, you were educated at a range of schools, from secular to an elite Orthodox yeshiva in Jerusalem. Was there a particular branch of Judaism that maybe impacted your path more than others?
So I have I've had a variety of Jewish influences on my life. I would say that I really have taken different things from different branches of Judaism. Since my mid-20s, late 20s, I've been very solidly in the humanist camp philosophically. I really admire the ethos. It really speaks to me that there's no gap between what you say and what you believe. That's something that speaks to me as somebody on the spectrum, as my literalness. And that's been very important to me. But I've also learned, for example, from the Orthodox communities that I've tended, been a part of, I've learned the importance of establishing community norms, and that what binds you together, the things that you do together rather than your beliefs. that you might have a variety of beliefs sometimes, and that's really true within the Orthodox community, but you practice together as a community, and I really appreciate that. I would say from Reconstructionist Judaism, relatives in Reconstructionist Judaism, I've learned that it's very important to be non-dogmatic, that there's just a wide variety of people out there, and make your best effort to welcome them where they are and not push people out. And I've really enjoyed that in Reconstructionist communities. In conservative communities, for example, it's there that the struggle between modernity, liberal values, and traditional Jewish sources is played out most. And I admire the leadership and the people in the community who really strive to make that work. And it's something ongoing. I would say that from renewal Judaism, I've learned that they're just brave about accepting truths from other religions, from other sources, in a way that other movements of Judaism are not. So yeah, I really have learned stuff from many branches of Judaism. Reform Judaism, I've not said anything about Reform Judaism. I've found in Reform Judaism, which might be a little bit ironic, a sense of rootedness. Like one of the congregations I attended in Israel was Reform, and it was just rooted in Israel. There was an Israeli Reform congregation. It wasn't trying to pretend something about itself that it wasn't. And I enjoyed that sense of authenticity there. Yeah, so really, I've tried to learn something from all the communities I have been a part of. Philosophically, for the past 20 years, I've been a humanist.
So while studying to be a rabbi, you not only earned one PhD, but you have two PhDs. So I'm particularly interested in the second PhD, which is in ancient wisdom literature. I'm wondering if you've learned anything about your autistic identity from studying text from ancient wisdom literature.
Absolutely. And I would say that I taught at the start of the pandemic. I started teaching an online class every day. Then it has gone down to twice a week on ancient wisdom literature. And I've gone through the major ancient wisdom literature texts, Jewish texts. And I've appreciated two things, I would say, about ancient wisdom literature. One is just this sense of practicality, the sense of very practical wisdom that's remained fairly timeless, and really, I appreciate the care of the thoughtfulness of the aphorisms. It's always nice to have good benchmarks, guides about how to act in the world, and like as somebody on the spectrum, I felt right and wrong very deeply from a very, very young age. From the time I was a small child, from the time I started speaking, like I've known this is right, this is wrong. And I would say that books like Proverbs allow me to give a mechanism to think about that. And it's really appeals to me as somebody who is attuned to secular wisdom as well. It's not, the book of Proverbs, for example, is not a religious text. It's a text of mostly practical wisdom. And I would say the second thing I learned, and that was, I wrote my doctorate on a book called Ben Sirah, which is a second century wisdom work written in Jerusalem, probably. And it's over there that I noticed something very interesting. The author of that book, or the primary author, I think there were a number of authors there, was a misogynist, a misogynist even relative to the world he was living in. So really anti-woman. And yet, in that book, you have some of the most beautiful odes to the female figure of wisdom. Really, imagining wisdom as a woman, and with such moving odes. And I just, something that I learned was, and it's apparent in the title to my book, So Compassionate It Hurts, is the way that love can destroy these boundaries between human beings. Like there's a saying in rabbinic literature, love destroys boundaries. And I married somebody neurotypical, and we've managed to create a home, a very loving home for our children. And really, it's because of love. It's because I deeply love my spouse, and she deeply loves me. And so we were able to bridge the neural makeups, the gaps. And that's something that I learned from wisdom literature, specifically Ben Sirah, and also later wisdom literature, wisdom of the fathers. And it's really, I think, been has had a profound effect on my life.
Now, you've referenced it a few times in this interview about a book that and there's one that you recently wrote. Thinking about the title of the book, myself and some of our listeners definitely can relate to that title, which is So Compassionate It Hurts. What was your inspiration to write this book?
I had two inspirations. I would say one was the way I experienced the beginning of the pandemic. I saw people around me suffering deeply, all kinds of people all around me. But I had a very productive and good year, the first year of the pandemic. And that discrepancy was jarring to me. And I felt guilty about it. I felt like, why am I having a good time, thriving, and all these people are suffering? And so this was part of processing that. And so processing for me for the last 25 years has been through writing. I started to write a book. And I would say the second has to do with my desire to segue to advocacy as part of who I am. And that has to do with my son, who is on the spectrum, on a deeper band of the spectrum. And I just want to be able to be the most effective advocate for him as possible. And so I wrote this book as a stepping stone to enter conversations such as the one we're having right now, for example. Enter conversations with other people who are focused on autism and are focused on understanding and accommodation and making the world a better place for people of neurodiversity.
And what can people expect from reading So Compassionate It Hurts?
Well, they can expect a journey that begins as somewhat, I posed the question at the beginning of the book, like how can this be, right? How can somebody like me, somebody who fits my profile, be a rabbi? It really doesn't make sense. And I hope that by the end of the book, it makes sense. It starts, and it just describes a particular journey of somebody on a spectrum. Everybody is, of course, different. I don't expect people will relate to every single section of my book. It's kind of me giving back, I would say, because the way I learned about being on the spectrum was through an autobiography. And I feel that the more personal journeys of people on the spectrum and who are neurodiverse, the better. The more people can know about us and if they are neurodiverse themselves, really find ways to relate, know that they are not alone. And I feel that is important. The more books like mine, the more autobiographies and more personal reflections on this, the better from my perspective. So, that's why I feel that it's important for the book to be out there. I don't think that everybody will relate to it, but I am hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. The more stories we can get out there about our experiences. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And how can our listeners learn more about and purchase your book, So Compassionate It Hurts?
So it's available on Amazon, or you could just write the title there, you'll find it, or just write in my name and it's one of the first couple of books that pop up. I've written a fair number of books. Most of them have to do with Bible and liturgy. Yeah. This will be very strikingly not about Bible and liturgy. And I'm hoping, because I'm very committed to accessibility, I'm hoping to publish this on Audible as well, so people could listen to the book instead of read it. I have somebody who's agreed in principle to record the book, and I'm hoping that in the next couple months that will be available that way as well.
So something that just popped into my mind, just kind of like one last question before we're done, is kind of reflecting back into my childhood of going to temple and just thinking about the rabbi and kind of on stage that, about sensory experiences for you. It might, at times it might seem like it's quiet, but people can be moving around. People maybe are in your congregation. Now, I'm sure this doesn't happen in your congregation, but sometimes I would get bored during this.
One hopes.
Yeah. Not with you, of course, Rabbi, but and people might be talking amongst themselves, turning pages, all different types of things can be happening. So what is your sensory experiences like during service? And
that's really a very good question. So I am blessedly able to tune most of that out because I have come to a deep acknowledgement that I can't understand most of what is going on in people's minds as they, fiddle around or use, fidget toys or turn the pages. Are they bored? Are they listening with half their minds? Are they not listening at all? So I just, I don't know what's going on. And so I say, okay, I'm just continuing with what I'm doing. As some people can relate to, the way I learned about basic body language was I read books. So I kind of got the basics down, but really the basics. And sometimes I can get a feel, people are not relating, people are bored, fidgeting, falling asleep. I can say, okay, maybe I have to shift. But usually I'm not attuned enough, and that has granted me the ability to not be apprehensive about it and just to go on with what I am doing. So I'm glad for that. That is, I would say, a blessing of, a silver lining of my inability to read a room.
Well, Rabbi, I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope people check out your book, So Compassionate It Hurts. And thanks so much for making the time to have this conversation today.
Absolutely, Doug. It was my pleasure.
Thanks so much to Rabbi Yoreh for the conversation. To learn more about Rabbi Yoreh's new book, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Helping autistic people find community that works for them is such an important part of what we do at Autism Personal Coach. If this is something that you're interested in learning more about, please visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information about how finding a community that is customized for you and that can bring you joy. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.